Okay. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining our event on community-owned homes, how COPA and TOPA can counter housing corporatization. We're gonna get started in about just 1 minute. We're just gonna let everyone filter in. So grab a glass of water, hang tight, and we'll be ready shortly. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining our event on community-owned homes. We're gonna get started in just 1 minute, so hang tight. We'll be getting started shortly. Hello, hello, and welcome to our event on community-owned homes. We're gonna get started in just about 30 seconds. So if you wanna go grab a drink of water or anything like that, go for it before we get started. All right, it is 12:03, so we're gonna go ahead and get started for real. So hello, welcome to our event on community-owned homes, how COPA and TOPA counters housing corporatization. My name is Marian Wellington, and I'm Tech Equity's Director of Content, and I'm thrilled to be with all of you today. We are really honored to be joined by three wonderful panelists today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves shortly, but before we get started, I want to make sure that anyone new joining gets an opportunity to know who we are and what we do at Tech Equity. So, Tech Equity, who we are. We bring together tech workers, activists, community members, and advocates to build a better tech economy. We investigate and address inequities in tech and as a result of tech's impact on our economy and our communities. So we do this in three main ways. We educate with events like this. We work in public policy. So we work in partnership with community groups to conduct research and develop a set of public policy priorities to advance our mission. And third, we engage in corporate practice. So where companies are willing, we work with them to improve the corporate practice to benefit their employees and all workers. So our two main areas of focus of our work are housing and labor. And I really want to thank you all for being here today. We love being able to provide these events to our community, and we miss seeing you in person. If you love these events, if you get something out of them, or you genuinely just like that an organization like us exists, please consider making a contribution. It helps us to keep existing. We're dropping a link in the chat. You can donate $10 a month or whatever works best for you. And we are extra excited to bring you this event in partnership with Somos Mayfair. So Somos Mayfair builds community power in East San Jose through leadership development and by organizing around resident-led solutions. Their mission is to support children, organize families, and connect neighbors to uplift the dreams, power, and leadership of community, and also address systemic inequities. They've been leading the effort to implement COPA in San Jose, which Andrea will get into about more shortly. And my colleague Herman will be dropping a link in this chat to their site, so please check them out. And before we get into the meat of this conversation, we have a few housekeeping items. So we do have the chat open, but we ask that you read our code of conduct, which Herman will be dropping in the chat, and that you please respect and honor it. We really try to foster safe spaces for learning, so please be respectful of your fellow attendees and their opinions. We also do have a Q&A section at the end of the conversation, so if you have any questions that you want the panelists to answer, please drop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat function because we probably won't see it there. And if you are joining late or you have any friends that are interested in sharing in this conversation will be recorded and shared afterwards, so please feel free to share around widely. And last but not least, we have ASL interpretation today. So thank you so much, Julie, for providing it. If you would like to see her interpretation, you just select American Sign Language in the interpretation feature at the bottom of your screen. All right, and with that, let's dive in. So we're here to talk about housing, getting housing back into the hands of residents, of tenants, and of longstanding members of the communities. So here at Tech Equity, we've explored tech's impact on housing through our Tech Bias and Housing Initiative. And throughout our research, we've seen a common thread. Private equity and venture capital-backed companies are buying homes up at mass scale and turning them around to rent them to the very people who they've priced out of the market. And what's more is that tech has enabled this. They've given to companies the tools to rapidly scale with automated property management, tenant screening, iBuying, rent setting, and more. In the face of this troubling dynamic in an already unaffordable housing market, we really need to explore policies that can reclaim housing and turn speculative property investments into real stable homes for real people. So like I said before, we're really fortunate to be joined by an incredible panel today. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. So Andrea, can you get started?
course. Thank you, Marian. Hey, everybody. My name is Andrea Portillo. I'm the Director of Organizing and Policy at Somos Mayfair. I was born and raised on the east side of San Jose and have been at Somos for 3 years now. Like Marian shared, Somos Mayfair builds community power in East San Jose through leadership development and by organizing around resident solutions. We've been working closely with our community, with partners, and the City of San Jose's Housing Department for over 4 years, really working to advance and explore anti-displacement strategies and policies to address the housing crisis that we're feeling so deeply in our community. And excited to be here and talk a little bit more about the work that we've been doing with COPA. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Richard?
Thanks, Marian. My name is Richard Hurlbert, and my background is in lawyering. I was a full-time tenant rights lawyer for about 20 years here in San Francisco, handled hundreds of eviction defense cases. And then I got involved in doing some real estate transactions for nonprofits that wanted to buy apartment buildings and turn them into affordable housing. And it sort of took over my life. I gave up my law practice, and I've been doing this real estate brokering for nonprofits pretty much full time for the last 7 years. I also represent tenants and groups of tenants who are buying their buildings. My office is 3 people, 2 brokers, 2 lawyers, and we're committed to anti-gentrification, basically, is our core mission.
Great. And Tanya?
Hello, I am Tanya Jackson. I am actually from Washington, D.C., but I did attend UC Berkeley for college back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, before there was an idea of needing tech equity. However, I have spent most of my career in community development and affordable housing. I have about 25 plus years. I've worked in on all different sides. I have TOPA expertise from actually being a practitioner. I've provided conversion assistance to several different buildings, but I'm most proud of the one that I live in. I live in a 15-unit cooperative where I was the advisor to a 75% senior citizen group that included my childhood babysitter. And what was already sort of a passion for me about making sure that the people that I grew up with and around got to stay in my community has turned into something I get to do every day from the city council, working for Councilmember Nadeau, who shares my same convictions and passions. We started 8 years ago with the idea that we could stem the tide of gentrification in Ward 1, which is our most pressed ward in the city, and that we could come up with equitable solutions for people to remain in place and feel valued.
That's wonderful. And actually, Tanya, since you're already talking, could you actually share the definition of TOPA just for everyone who is maybe unfamiliar with the concept? And then Richard, if you can share how COPA differs from TOPA.
So the thing that I will table set by saying Washington, D.C. did not become a place with self-governance until the 70s, until I was here and walking around. We did not have the right to vote. We didn't have the right to participate in national elections. We didn't have any representation, but we get to pay all the taxes. So when we did finally get home rule in the 70s, most of our founding fathers and mothers came from the civil rights movement. We had a bunch of people from SNCC and the Black Panther Party, like my mom, and people from all different walks of social justice movements who came to Washington, D.C. to help us gain our freedom and implement our new government focus. And one of them in 1979 was the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. We had a huge number of landlords burning buildings down, illegally removing tenants, and selling buildings to developers. And the council acted by giving tenants the opportunity to purchase their buildings themselves. They get 2 bites of the apple. You have the first right of refusal, and you also have the opportunity to match an offer from a third party. And then we have a timeline that we built in for everybody to ramp up to learn how to do it. And as a result, we had a robust, very bright, very capable group of nonprofits rise up and help tenants do it. So we have had, since 1979, a huge number of buildings convert to be co-ops, condos, rental, and we have tenants who are still in control of their building, and they get to stay in the neighborhoods that they have contributed to for years and years.
That's wonderful. And what's it like being a resident of a TOPA building yourself?
I think it's wonderful and difficult, as anything that involves human beings is. But one of the things that's really great about going through the process together is you spend a lot of time deciding what's going to be your normal in your building. And when we first started this process, the then president, who unfortunately passed this year, who was my babysitter when I was growing up, Mrs. Dolores Tucker, announced to everybody that our building was going to be called the Friendly Neighbors Cooperative, because we were going to be friendly to each other. And she said it exactly like that.
I love
But that is what happens with, I think, with when tenants have the opportunity to take control, they say, these are the things I don't like, and these are the things I do like. And we came up with a bunch of stuff that we really did like. And they decided, the elders in my building had been running the building cooperatively for more than 50 years. And so they decided that they wanted to be an official co-op. But in a TOPA building, you will find that it's people who have taken control. So they have deliberately come up with the style of housing that they live in. They are connected to their neighbors, they're connected to the community, and they're in touch with their government too. They're very civically involved. Almost all of the TOPA buildings that exist all over the city are well known to the communities that they're a part of, because they are a stabilizing force in a lot of unstable neighborhoods. And we like to talk about the old folks in our building who used to get up and clean the alley and the street when the city couldn't afford to do it very well. They would get everybody else organized. They would feed people. They would do grocery shopping together. When I moved in, I became a volunteer because I'm young. So I was a driver for a lot of people, and I would take them to their appointments and things like that. We all decided that we were going to live in community that way and know each other deeply and help each other. So it can be a really wonderful experience in that regard, because everybody is intentional about where they want to live and how they want to interact.
That sounds amazing. We were just talking. I know everyone here is familiar with the atmospheric rivers that have been going on in California, and when faced with this crisis, we were all talking about, like, should we build bunkers? Should we do this? And like most people on the team were like, no, we just need to like know our neighbors and have relationships with the people that we live with. So like both in times of crisis and in times of joy, we're able to support each other. So it's wonderful to hear that that's being enacted in these type of buildings in DC. Now, Richard, I would love to hear from you about the difference between TOPA and COPA and how you helped craft San Francisco's COPA policy back in 2019.
Okay. Well, the difference between TOPA and COPA is who has this preemptive right to purchase. Under TOPA, it's tenants or occupants of the building. Under COPA, it's community organizations, usually. Community land trusts, CDCs, community organizations, maybe there's quite a wide variety it can be. Here in San Francisco, we have a COPA, we do not have a TOPA. And I was invited to the process when they were talking about making a COPA. I came in fairly late in that process when they're looking for someone with some transactional experience, and I think they wanted to draft some language to see how the COPA would actually work. And so I came in on that, and I worked with the city attorneys, and I worked with the community organizations, and there were meetings, and we got it passed, and now we have a COPA, and it's up and running.
That's so exciting. And in the last 4 years since its adoption, how have you seen the COPA policy impact SF's notorious housing crisis?
Well, I think what's really affected the housing market here in San Francisco is the pandemic, really, in that time period. We did start to buy some buildings. We were actually, the community organizations and my office were buying buildings before COPA passed. It was just a lot harder, and we continued buying the buildings, and there was actually an increase. We had some in contract when the pandemic hit, and then we were able to finish all the ones we had in the pipeline during 2020, but then there was some concern about whether we would get state money the next year to be able to buy more buildings, and so it kind of shut us down for about a year, and we're still getting going, and now it seems like we're back on a good footing, and we can move forward. It is a real advantage though, and it makes it quite a bit easier, and it really normalizes the process to have a COPA in place, because it I think invited the realtors who actually stood up and said they weren't all for it, but they created forms to enable the process to happen. They educated all of their agents, because that's what real estate agents actually do, is they help buyers and sellers comply with a myriad of laws out there that govern real estate transactions. COPA is just one of them, and they were a real help to normalizing the process. And there's some other reasons too, like we get to talk to the tenants. Before, they wouldn't let us do that. There were some really good reasons why sellers would not want any real estate people or buyers talking to the tenants, because they're afraid of tenants being harassed or suing the sellers. But now, we have qualified nonprofits who are professionals, and they actually have a right under COPA to talk with the tenants, because the tenants need to know what's going on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so just for, practical application, I've lived in San Francisco for 7 years, and I've been in my building for the last 5. And I know a couple of my neighbors and I have been like, wouldn't it be great if we could just own this building? And so I'm wondering for San Francisco, if our landlord decided to sell, what would be the process? Would people reach out to us? Would we have to already know about the COPA policy? How would that go around?
There is a change in effect that the mayor's office, I believe, is drafting now a form that the seller will be required to give to the tenants when they notify the nonprofits about putting the building on the market for sale. That'll be a good start, actually, because the way the process is now, really an oversight on my part and everyone's part, is when no one's notifying the tenants when the building goes for sale. And actually, I think that's a big problem more, because we don't have a TOPA. We have buildings that sell where the tenants are at risk of eviction, and they don't even know their building's for sale. So that's something that we all know about now, and we're working on changing that. But to answer your question, what you would do is, and when you find out your building's for sale, or maybe even before, if you find out that, maybe the landlord's managing the building themselves and they are getting up in years, maybe they would like to sell the building. And so you would want to reach out to a nonprofit or my office. I know most of the nonprofits, and the idea is getting a fit between your living situation in your neighborhood and your tenant profile and the nonprofit. Depends on the size of the building too, and who's living there. And hopefully the nonprofit would want to buy the building, and if it fits the mayor's office new guidelines, then they can get funding under the small sites program to make the purchase.
Got it. Great. Thank you for the rundown. Now I personally know what we would do if our landlord decides to sell. But in a larger perspective, zooming out, we've seen, COPA and TOPA, even though the only existing policies right now are in DC and San Francisco, like you both have mentioned, we've seen the policies gain popularity as an anti-displacement and as affordable housing preservation tool. And so, Andrea, I know you've worked on the COPA campaign in San Jose for the past few years. So I would love to hear about how you and other advocates decided on COPA rather than TOPA for San Jose. We'd just love to hear about the birth of the campaign and where we're at today.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say I really appreciate hearing Tanya and Richard's perspective. I think it just gives us, we're really excited about this policy. We've been working really hard for this policy, and just hearing about the possibilities and the opportunities that a policy like a COPA provides to help us address a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the community is just really insightful. So I appreciate hearing from their perspective. So we've been organizing in our community for years, trying not only to address the housing crisis, but really combat like a lot of communities. I think the impacts of historical housing segregation policies that continue to disproportionately impact our immigrant communities of color. And so we really began our advocacy work a lot around, making improvements to our neighborhood and our community, from like advocating for street lights and sidewalk improvements, and then began to continue to advocate for tenant protections. We were seeing a lot of unlawful evictions and just the need for more tenant protections in the community. We also started, advocating towards for more affordable housing in our communities as well. But we quickly realized, and I think this is like a big shift for our organizing efforts, that this wasn't, simply advocating for more affordable housing wasn't enough to really address the needs of the community. Not only were we not building enough affordable housing, but a lot of the folks in our communities continue to be denied access to that housing due to documentation status, a lot of different factors. And so we really began to, took a step back, reflect, like, what else could we do to really address the needs of housing in our communities? So we began to learn about a lot of other anti-displacement policies and strategies that other cities were implementing, both locally, regionally, but also across the country. So we organized, we built coalitions, worked with a lot of partners and with the housing department. And in 2020, we were able to pass a 10-point anti-displacement strategy plan for the city of San Jose. And COPA was the third strategy in that anti-displacement strategy plan. So in the beginning of our advocacy around COPA, we had a lot of questions. We really wanted to get input from the community around specifically what this policy should include. Like, how could we make sure that this was really a community-centered policy that really addressed the needs of the folks most at need? So we had a lot of conversations around like a COPA versus a TOPA, and we heard a lot from community around the need and the importance for community ownership and autonomy and decision-making in their housing. I think unfortunately, San Jose, does not have a really strong tenant association or union culture, paired with like extremely high costs of living, high cost of property costs. It felt like more of a heavier lift for tenants. And so we decided to go with a COPA policy to support the process. And with the work that we've been doing with the housing department, with community, again, hearing how important it was for tenants to have voice and autonomy in their housing situations, we've been really trying to work to make sure that a lot of that language and tenant engagement is really strong and prevalent in our COPA framework. For example, including language around potential pathways to ownership for tenants, conversions into co-ops, working with community land trusts and their models to ensure that tenants are not only engaged in the COPA process once it starts, but also there are potential opportunities for folks to become owners of their property or unit if that's something that they'd like to do. So we've been working on this policy specifically for like 2 years now. There's been, some shifts, some delays, a lot of ups and downs, but we're really hoping to see the policy make its way to city council this spring. And so fingers crossed for April, it'll make its way to council and we can finally get this across the finish line and then do a lot of the work that, that is still left to come. With education, tenant engagement, all of the key pieces that are going to make this policy really successful.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing. And it's really fun to have all three of you here together to have like existent policies and have the lessons learned that you've already had from them. And then also, this exciting middle, I guess, of the campaign to implement it in San Jose. So as more and more advocates are campaigning for COPA and TOPA in the Bay, and there's a TOPA policy, I've seen it in the chat, they're talking about a TOPA policy emerging in Berkeley. And then also across the country, I imagine that they'll be turning to DC and SF to understand how they can craft the policy to best fit their cities. So Tanya and Richard, I would love to hear from you. What have been some of the greatest challenges you've seen TOPA and COPA face in your cities respectively? And what advice would you give housing advocates for those who are trying to establish TOPA or COPA in their cities?
Well, I was going to say, I'm kind of proud of myself because I have participated in panels in Berkeley about TOPA. I was invited to talk and I got to talk a little bit about my experience living there and then also sort of helping with the idea. And then I did testify also before the Massachusetts state legislature about implementing a TOPA program there. The biggest challenge is from capitalism. That's the biggest challenge.
Yep.
I mean, like I said, we started off with a city that was sort of being run by a bunch of ex-civil rights people who all had a heart for justice and a way, and a desire to help figure out how to make things happen. And truthfully, like many of the major cities in America, we only gained control of DC because of white flight and because it just was sort of left in the dust by a bunch of people who no longer felt like it was valuable. So we were able to do a lot of things, I think in the 70s and 80s that would never happen now. But as a direct result of a lot of those choices, a lot of the programs that we made, we have actually participated in bringing DC back and making a market that people want to participate in. That's kind of the irony. And I think that the thing that happens every single year with TOPA is, on the one hand, there's a desire to make it the most perfect tool we can make it. There are places where we know there need to be changes in what is a very old policy in the district. And we have been really careful and surgical about changing them, because on the other hand, on the other side, there are voices that want it to go away completely. And the constant challenge is really from I find very paternalistic, capitalistic perspective of sort of saying with this very offhand tone, oh, those people, they don't know how to develop a building. They don't know how to run a building. Like, why are we asking? And the implication is, why are we asking poor, uneducated people to take control of their lives? They can't do that. And the reality of the situation is, like I said, a whole robust industry grew up around COPA when we implemented it in DC. We actually, the District of Columbia actually pays several nonprofits to be free of charge with the tenants, not with the developers, not with the community, not with not representing anybody other than the tenants, and getting them to consensus about what do you want to do. And in some cases it's take a buyout, but what do you want to do? Who do you want to work with? And what would you like to see at the end of it? And then putting together your team that helps you figure that out. The constant challenges from the other side is our property values have increased. I know you can relate to this in San Jose and in San Francisco and in Oakland and in Berkeley and in Emeryville, which did not really exist when I was in college, beyond industrial. We've seen these incredible shifts of like who wants to live in cities, and they are driving all of the prices up, and it becomes more and more impossible. We used to have much more of a commitment from the district government to start to finish fund these projects. And now, because of the sheer volume of need, people have to learn how to leverage their investment. So it has become a little more difficult in the sense that you do have to put together a bigger package in order to get across the finish line. But it's something that's not impossible. And it's something worth fighting for, because we do know, I did a study of limited equity co-ops when I worked at the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development back in the very beginning of the 2000s. And that was the first generation of LECs that I was looking at. And we had more than 75 that had survived and were robust, but didn't really have a lot of support. And that's so I think the two things are making sure that you have created a policy that's flexible enough to work with the wide variety of people who live in your city, and be vigilant enough to say, this is something that matters to me. So every single time there's a discussion about it or a vote about it, I'm going to be there and talk about what a great tool this is and advocate for more money to go into funding it.
Great, thank you. Richard, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, ditto on the toils and troubles of doing this kind of work in a capitalist economy. It's just hard that way, but it is getting better. I think now there's a lot of trust. There's a lot of trust out there in the market among the listing agents and among the realtors and among some lenders. They know that the nonprofits are experienced and that they can actually buy, and they really do buy. And it turns out a lot of people would rather sell their building to a nonprofit if they could. They actually like the idea, as long as they're going to get their money. And so I think we've actually come a long way, but still what we do is really hard. There's a lot. I mean, we're paying market price for buildings. We're actually doing renovations. We're paying prevailing wages for the renovations, where the nonprofits are taking the buildings subject to deed restrictions voluntarily, of course, because they want to provide affordable housing, but they're paying market price, doing renovations, and then committing permanently to only rent to low or very low income people. That's hard. That's going to be very hard. And that part's always going to be a challenge. Another challenge is just with the nonprofit capacity. It takes a lot of work and time and effort to just communicate with the tenants, gain their trust, actually talk with them enough so they understand that they're giving up rent control and they're taking on affordable housing protections. It's a different scheme, but they have to make an informed choice. And that we have a value on transparency and informed choice there, but I wonder if that's really necessary, or how much of that is necessary during the purchase process, because it really does take a lot of time and energy, and people get all sorts of wild ideas. Whereas, in the private market, they just sell a building, they don't even tell people it's sold. So I'm working to try to smooth that process so that maybe the switch from affordable to affordable housing goes unit by unit instead of building by building. But overall, it's that capitalist system and doing good work in a for-profit environment. It's hard.
A constant uphill battle. Yep. And we've talked about this earlier on in the conversation, but we're at a direct tension between housing as a human need and housing as an asset and as an investment, both for homeowners and individuals, but also for corporations. And like I mentioned before, we know through our research in the Tech Bias and Housing Initiative that we have tools, that tech tools have enabled private equity and venture capital backed companies to expand their operations at a mass scale. And we have a paper that I think Herman can drop in the chat, please, and thank you, in which we talk about, like, after the Great Recession, we saw these tools really explode the corporate landlord and corporate homeownership market. Oh, Tony, did you want to hop in first before we move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing. Yeah. One of the things that I also genuinely see happening is sort of a rejiggering of redlining. So what Andrea is talking about in San Jose, and like who's being affected, we have the same issue in DC. We're a sanctuary city. We're really proud of being a sanctuary city. We've been a sanctuary city since people started fleeing violence in Central America in the 80s. And the rule in DC for the longest time was you only needed to prove that you had an address in the District of Columbia. You did not need to prove that you were a legal resident of the United States. Because if you lived in the district and you worked in the district or in Maryland, we're catching your taxes. So you certainly have bought into a system that you're supporting. And we're really proud of that. But another threat has been the federal government, because we're not a state, the federal government, regularly comes in and tries to change that. And it becomes a thing where you see neighborhoods that have historically sheltered specific populations change almost overnight because of the forces that come in and freak everybody out. And we really have fought that very, 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 very hard here. And especially in Ward 1, which is the most diverse ward in the city, and home to Ward 1 and 4, home to the largest Latino populations in the city. And it's just been a sea change from what it was like when I grew up. And you see people just being forced out of specific neighborhoods because the property values are suddenly so great that we don't really care about these people anymore.
Right. Yeah. And we know that there's a huge relationship between the redlining maps of the 50s and 60s and how communities are resourced, under-resourced, or over-resourced in our cities today. And we've seen how these corporate landlords that come into these cities really exacerbate and accelerate gentrification and displacement, especially in neighborhoods that have been under-resourced and redlined for decades. And we had a conversation last fall about the corporate housing takeover in Atlanta. And also we've seen it, across the country as well. So I'd love to know from you all, what impact are you seeing corporate landlords having in your cities respectively? And how is their mass expansion into housing impacting residents in your communities? Free for anyone to take.
We have, I'll go first. We have some large corporate landlords that have a sophisticated business model, and it involves, you might say, waging construction on the residents so that they move out. And they, of course, would deny that, but the numbers, I think, speak for themselves. The displacement happens when they buy a building, and it's a real problem. And that's rent control, I think, is awesome. We need it. It's a cornerstone of our anti-displacement policy, but it kind of puts tenants it poses them as enemies to the landlords, and we end up with no fault evictions. We end up with a disincentive to maintain, or perhaps no waging construction or some other forms of tenant harassment. We have vacancy control or vacancy decontrol under most California local rent ordinances. All the new buildings are exempt. We've got almost 40, 50 years of new buildings that are exempt from rent control. We need affordable housing, and we need to start having some 21st century ideas for how we're going to operate these policies, and letting the big landlords and the foreign corporate entities buy up our housing stock. It's just not a plan. It doesn't help us. It fosters all kinds of distrust and animosity and litigation, and it frankly extracts money from our local population, and it sends it to whoever these foreign investors are that participate in these REITs, and it's very destructive.
Absolutely. Andrea, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think, we have done some digging to see if we can find out who some of these investors are, especially in our community. I think there are whole blocks that are owned by the same folks. And oftentimes we're having to figure out who are the owners of the property, doing a lot of digging. And then, folks are under LLCs. And then how do we find the information? How do we get in contact with them? So I definitely think that it's something that is happening, but the process for, finding ways to communicate or ensure that tenants are aware or have, access to information, access to, to be able to build relationships or just know who the owners of their properties are, I think is really important. And also why a policy like COPA, and I think why a shift in the way that we are envisioning housing is so important, because of how important it is to build relationships, to have voice, autonomy, decision-making over housing. And so I think a lot of times we run into, situations and stories of community members where they have no idea. They have no idea who the property owner is. They have no idea how to get in contact with them. They have made complaints and haven't, seen any upkeep on their property. There's so many stories, and I think it's very difficult to track. It's very difficult to know, and why we've been advocating for policies like this that kind of shift the relationship between a tenant and an owner.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's clear that our housing crisis is complex, and it requires a lot of different approaches to address it, especially in the face of these corporate landlords that are coming in and buying up at mass scale. And at Tech Equity, at least, we often talk about the 3 Ps of housing. So for those that are unfamiliar, we have production. So we need to build more housing at all levels of affordability, especially at lower levels. Protection, we need to protect tenants and homeowners so they can stay in their homes in the first place. And preservation, we need to preserve existing affordable housing and potentially convert existing housing into affordable housing like COPA and TOPA does. So COPA and TOPA both, I think, would fall under preservation and protection. But obviously, it needs to be in context with the other tools at our disposal. And so I'd love to hear from each of you. And then after this, I think we'll move on to Q&A, and I'll bring my colleague Megan to the chat. But before that, yeah, if each of you could to share, what do you think are the most important tools we have to address the housing crisis, and especially those that have an interrelationship to COPA and TOPA? So, anyone's game.
I mean, I think for San Jose's context, we've been doing a lot of work with key partners, our local community land trust, South Bay Community Land Trust, other organizations that do a lot of housing advocacy work, to really think about what does the preservation or ecosystem need to look like in San Jose to really address all of the needs, because there's many needs. And like you mentioned, Marian, they need to work in tandem with each other, all three of the strategies. And so I think that is really important. And also, I think, specifically for COPA, we get a lot of pushback, or we hear a narrative around, is this policy really worth it? Is this strategy really worth it to address a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our communities? And I think it's a tool, right? Like, this is a strategy that's part of a larger strategies in order to address displacement and the housing crisis. And it's important, right? The strategies need to work together, but also a policy like COPA opens the door to a lot of the amazing work and ecosystem that, is being built in Washington, D.C., for example, and in San Francisco. It really shifts the way that, not only tenants are engaged in housing in terms of autonomy, but also the opportunities that it provides for other, community land trusts to form, to get in on the game, to support with the work that they've been doing as well. So they definitely all are very important, and also need to feed off and work together in order for us to really address a lot of the issues that we're seeing.
Absolutely. Tanya, I know you've been doing a lot of affordable housing work over the many years you've been doing this great work. So yeah, wondering what, on your perspective, of what policies you think are most important, especially in relation to COPA TOPA.
Well, so the thing that what I think, getting again, playing on the theme of what has happened over the years in terms of where ideology has shifted in the district, because we're no longer run by a bunch of activists, but we still are very left leaning. The two things that you really, really need are money and more money. So my thing is, with affordable housing, we always need cheap patient money. And one of the big sources that we have for that in the district is the Housing Production Trust Fund, which is our only locally funded source. And we are really taxed. We really tax the fund because the need outpaces it every year, even though we put more and more money into it. So I think it's really important to have dedicated, thoughtful sources of money for people to not only acquire property, not just for the nonprofits to be able to actually get in there and do the acquisition in a timely fashion, but also to shore up the expertise that's needed to help people and to help figure out how to troubleshoot stuff that comes along, because every single TOPA deal that I've ever done has been different, and every single one has needed different things. By and large, nonprofit developers are willing to incur a lot of brain damage to figure out how to get a project done. I have one project that we did on Georgia Avenue that at the end of it, we ended up using 7 different sources of money for it. And it took us 2.5 years to get it done. But I drive by it and I'm really happy because I know everybody who lives there can afford to live there, and they got to, they get to enjoy their community. I think a big part of what everybody really needs to focus on is lots of good funding sources and lots of good, useful policy tools. So refining your policy to make sure that it really does fit the landscape, making sure that you do come up with ways to shore up notifying people, helping people understand what they've been notified about, helping people take advantage of their rights. I think it's like, putting the money always needs to go where the people are. And I think that it really needs to be intentional and thoughtful on the part of legislatures and policymakers. You really need to think about, like, what happens in this process and what needs to happen in this process, and listen to the people who've been through it and are telling you these are the things we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, anything to add on this before we hop into Q&A?
I just want to echo the funding is necessary. But it seems like a lot, but that is money very well spent, because these buildings aren't just going to last for the occupants who live there, now. These buildings are going to serve the community for generations, for centuries perhaps. And it is really by far the best kind of investment we can make, I think, is to invest for the future of the community. And really what we're doing, I think, is we're eroding, and maybe someday we can abolish altogether. I know this is a pie in the sky idea, but we are undermining the current system, which is private for-profit landlording, which that's the norm. And we have a terrible over-reliance on that. It's a toxic relationship for the individual people, and it's a toxic relationship for our communities. And so I think it's money well spent, and probably preaching to the choir here, but the more we can use TOPAs and COPAs and investments in social housing and fostering co-ops and operating housing, for the residents and for their quality of life, that's money very well spent.
Hear, hear. And with that, I think it's time for us to move into our Q&A. So I'm going to bring our Senior Director of Advocacy, Megan Abel, to the conversation. Hey, Megan.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for an incredibly fruitful conversation, and we've got a really active Q&A and chat, so I'm excited that this conversation is sparking a lot of ideas and questions amongst our audience. To kick things off, I'd love to go with a question we have here about the benefits and drawbacks of a COPA versus a TOPA policy. Why would you do one over the other, and why not try a policy that combines both community and tenant opportunity to purchase? Every community context is, of course, super unique, but if you can try to describe why your community that you work in went with one version of the policy over another, that would be super useful for our audience. Anyone who wants to jump in?
I'll be that guy who goes first again. Here in San Francisco, we have COPA. We do not have a TOPA. And I wish I had been around when they were first making that decision. I was not involved in that. But from what I can tell, it was really based on some antiquated thinking, that they were afraid of a TOPA because there was a law, an initiative passed in Santa Monica back in the 80s, put forth by the real estate industry, that was really just an end run around the limitations on condo conversions, which they were trying to limit at the time, and they still are. And that was called a TOPA. And that is not what our modern TOPAs are. It's the opposite of what our modern TOPAs are. And unfortunately, I think that really contributed in San Francisco to some fear of passing anything called a TOPA, and they just weren't willing to go there. And I'm running into that same sort of antiquated thinking now, but we have so we have some work to do here, because I'd really like to see a TOPA passed in San Francisco. And frankly, I think there's a place for both of them, and they're both really necessary. In my mind, TOPAs are perhaps more situated, best used for smaller buildings, and then COPAs is more for organizations that are buying larger buildings and have more of a property management expertise. But it's really important, I think, to have both.
Yeah, and
Anything to add? Oh.
yeah, I think I spoke to it a little bit earlier, but definitely, I think, big pushback that we heard from community around the need for a TOPA as well. But again, thinking about the landscape of San Jose, I think the ecosystem, we decided to advocate for a COPA because just the culture of San Jose is not one that's very strong in tenant organizing, unionizing, and tenant associations. So we felt that, let's get COPA across the finish line, include some very COPA, TOPA language in there, and really strengthen the role of tenants and in the process, include some pathways to ownership. But for sure, I think it's definitely something to Richard's point that can happen and should happen. They can both, it could be a hybrid model, it could be both of them. I think it's really important to uplift tenants in these policies. So.
Well, obviously, I love TOPA as a tool, but I do think the thing that is really important about our tool is there is a really specific process that you have to go through if you're a landlord to notify your tenants. And the entire nonprofit community and the city government is notified as a result. So we know at any given time that there are this many buildings that are in process. We don't necessarily know that all of them will exercise their rights, but we know, where it's happening and when it's happening. We have in the district what's called DOPA, which gives the District of Columbia the opportunity to purchase buildings as well. We have never used that tool. I was part of the group that got it implemented a long time ago, and it's never, ever, ever, ever been used. We've tried, I feel like every single year that my boss has been in office, we have tried to come up with a project that we can get the mayor to jump on, and it just has not happened. But I do think that it's really important to be able to save not only the large scale properties where, like we have one development in Columbia Heights that's like 1,500 units of affordable housing on its own. So any thought of it failing is, absolutely a nightmare to us, and we will do everything to shore it up. But when you have like really big buildings that come up that are naturally occurring affordability, or they're in a neighborhood that's vulnerable, I would love it if I could see more people in community screaming and yelling at their elected leadership to take a hold of that property and make it affordable to people who live in the city and are contributing right now, instead of just sort of going, oh, well, as people come in and buy up. Because we have TOPA, we have Amazon coming to the Washington metropolitan area. And one of our sort of buttresses against the Amazon effect that happened in Seattle is our TOPA laws. So they can't come in and buy up buildings large scale in DC, and we don't have that much land, so they can't come in and build large scale in DC, but they sure are eating up. Amazon's buying up everything in Northern Virginia, like everything. And the parts of Northern Virginia that are close in don't look anything like they looked even 2 years ago because of that. So I do think that it's really important not only to have a tool in place that allows people to act, but gives them enough runway to act. And if you've got multiple people being notified, then you have the opportunity to really rally the troops when it comes to especially significant properties that really need intervention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the thoughtful insights and responses, and actually some of the things that you said, Tanya, around the noticing process that you have in place in DC and communication to tenants is a conversation that's coming up as a recurring theme in the Q&A. Lots of questions in here around what are best practices in communicating to and supporting tenants before, during, and after an acquisition. And also questions about how to run these projects effectively. There are questions in here around whether there are challenges in getting and setting aside funding to do the preservation and renovation that's necessary on many of these projects. And also how the interworkings of tenant councils function, whether there's difficulties in getting tenants who want to participate in tenant councils because of work schedules, family life, et cetera. So a lot of folks in here just generally looking for a deeper dive into those aspects of how these agreements work out over time.
Well, there are a lot of buyouts, because with TOPA, you have the ability to assign your right. I mean, you have to assign your rights basically to a developer to redevelop your building. And sometimes for-profit developers come in and offer to buy the whole building out, and they will, offer everybody 15 grand or 25 grand or some amount of money that they've never seen in one place before. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm leaving. Or, sometimes with the help of a nonprofit, there's a negotiated buyout that helps resettle people nearby, or helps come up with a creative plan. But that's one of the downsides. I think the upsides of having sort of a long view of this now in the district is that we do see the places where there are major difficulties, and I would be remiss if I didn't point them out. The biggest difficulty of any project, whether it's tenant involved or not, is just human beings. So the thing with tenant opportunity to purchase is you've got to get the tenant group to be solidified. And I never have worked on any TOPA project where people didn't get into fights with each other or disagree with one another, but you have to have a good team in place that helps mediate meetings and moderate meetings, and gives people usable information and set goals for folks. The hardest things are keeping the whole group together and finding all the funding that you need. And I think with most TOPA projects, we end up having to do sort of a staging of renovation of like, what's your baseline thing that you have to get done? How much money is that going to cost? And figuring out how to do that. And then staying with the tenant association for like maybe a phase 2, and then really helping them wrap all of that financing up together. And that's hard. I mean, that's labor intensive, but it's also something that a lot of our nonprofits do and do well. I think the other thing that is a real challenge is we have not built a robust support system for co-ops in particular that have come from this. And so a lot of times co-ops are relying on, sometimes we're relying on national organizations or local nonprofits to help us troubleshoot, but there are a lot of management companies that don't want to manage cooperatives because it's a lot of people telling you what to do. And there are a lot of places where the city hasn't thought through what kinds of ongoing funding needs we have. We used to have an office dedicated in the Department of Housing and Community Development to co-ops, and we don't have that anymore. We don't have anybody with long-term cooperative expertise really focused in on them. So I think the long-term solutions are making sure you have a really robust system for a lot of these buildings, whether they become co-ops or condos or stay multifamily rental, but like that there's a specific place they can go to when they get into trouble, because everybody needs pre-crisis, post-purchase counseling.
Right.
And if you get it before crisis, then you can really save the building.
Makes a lot of sense. I think we have time for about one more question, so Megan, take it away.
Yeah, in our final minute together before the hour, would love to hear how folks can support COPA and TOPA coming to their city. What actions can they take? How do they get involved?
Yeah, for San Jose, we're actively in campaign mode. We're moving the work as we're going. So definitely check out our website. There's a button on there to sign our petition, to get in contact with us. The city's housing department is also hosting public meetings on COPA specifically. Next Wednesday, I can drop the information in the chat for folks to get involved, but come out, learn more about the policy, reach out to us at Somos Mayfair or partners to get tapped into the work.
Absolutely. And there are also a couple of active campaigns across the Bay in Berkeley. They're doing a TOPA campaign, and in East Palo Alto. So if you live in Berkeley, East Palo Alto, or San Jose, please check out the local campaigns in your city. I think that's all the time we have. We're actually 1 minute over, so I'm going to close out here. But Richard and Tanya, if you have any more calls to action, if you email me, we can put it in the follow-up email afterwards. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. And thank you to our panel for bringing your incredible insights and experience to our community. This has been such a generative conversation. I've had a blast. Like Andrea said, please join the San Jose discussion next Wednesday. If you live in San Jose, And if you like this educational content and appreciate that there are organizations like all of ours bringing tech workers into this discussion, please become a regular contributor and help us ensure that we can keep doing this work. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.